Halford Mackinder didn't found Geopolitics, but he remains its most influential figure. Whether you agree with his theory or not, it serves as the foundation for most geopolitical theories. And, by the way, it even ended up shaping the foreign policy of several nations in the following century, and probably in the ones to come. So today we're going to look at Mackinder's theory, the Heartland theory, or the Continental Heart theory, in Portuguese. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the World Geopolitics channel to show your support. Your help is very important for the channel to stay alive and keep existing. And consider becoming a member. Become a member. You won't just get early access to the channel's content, but you'll also be part of a select community for discussions on geopolitics. On Telegram, you'll be able to watch exclusive live streams with the members and series that are also exclusive to members. And of course, you'll be helping to ensure that the Geopolitical Mundial channel stays alive. I'm Delio nas portas da cidade, and this is Geopolitical Mundial. Next. The first and most important thing we need to keep in mind when we talk about Mackinder is the period in which he wrote his theories. That's because he was describing an absolutely new and unprecedented geopolitical scenario at that time. By the end of the 19th century, there were no more blank spaces on the map. Basically, there was no more space to be filled by nations and empires without causing friction with other nations and empires. Mackinder's main work was the famous article, The Geographical Pivot of History, which he explored. The thesis that human history is deeply conditioned by geographic and structural factors, suggesting that certain physical elements are particularly decisive in defining the course of societies and major historical events. Mackinder begins his analysis by identifying the last 400 years as a specific era, which he calls the Columbian Era. This period, which began with the great navigations and geographical explorations of the 15th and 16th centuries, was mainly characterized by European expansion around the world, almost without facing large-scale resistance from other peoples. During this time, explorers like Vasco da Gama and others dramatically reduced the unknown parts of the planet, accurately mapping each region and leading to the political appropriation of the discovered lands by European states. Mackinder argues that at the beginning of the 20th century, the world had practically ended this phase of free and unrestricted territorial expansion, entering a new post-Columbian era characterized by a global political system that is closed and interdependent. With this, the space that was once empty or unknown, which allowed European expansion without large-scale direct conflicts between the powers, was now completely occupied and politically demarcated, making direct conflicts and tensions between industrialized nations over limited space and resources inevitable. In this new globalized and interconnected scenario, any conflict, crisis, or change in one part of the planet will have immediate and profound impacts in other places, generating what he compares to the difference between the fall of a projectile in an open, uninhabited space, generating what he compares to a projectile in open, uninhabited space. The projectile in open, uninhabited space generating what he compares to a projectile in open and uninhabited space. A crucial point raised by Mackinder is his criticism of the traditional historical perspective, which considered only European history as relevant. Mackinder suggests a different view. For him, European civilization did not arise spontaneously, but as a defensive reaction against external pressures coming mainly from Asia. In this way, he proposes to momentarily reverse the angle of traditional historical analysis, placing European history in a secondary position compared to Asian history. Mackinder exemplifies this idea by showing how important European national entities such as the English, the French, the German, or even the concept of Christendom. They arose precisely in contexts of defensive wars against barbarian invaders, especially those coming from Central Asia, such as the Huns, the Mongols, and other nomadic peoples of the steppes. And in this, he explores in detail the geographical role of Russia, identifying it as a key territory to understand this Eurasian historical dynamic. Geographically, Russia has a vast plain that occupies a large part of the European continent, strongly contrasting with the nations of Western Europe, which have smaller territories more clearly defined by natural barriers. He notes that, historically, Russia was divided by two major geographic zones. To the north, immense forests and swamps. To the south, a vast open steppe, favorable to invasions coming from Asia. This geographic division shaped Russian and European development for centuries. The physical border between forest and steppe crossed the Russian territory diagonally, directly influencing the migratory movements and invasion routes of the nomadic peoples who came from Central Asia. From the 5th to 16th centuries, tribes such as the Huns, Avars, Bulgars, Magyars, and Mongols repeatedly moved through these steppes, invading and destabilizing settled societies, creating waves of forced migration that profoundly changed the European history that followed. These invasions were not isolated events, but true historical engines that drove major changes in society and politics. The presence of the Huns under Attila, for example, had such major implications for the formation of modern European nations that, without him, we would probably be seeing a different world. The Hun invasion helped define the French identity by uniting diverse groups such as the Franks and Romans against this unusual enemy of both. This led tribes like the Angles and Saxons to migrate to England, founding the roots of the English people. It caused the transformation of Venice following the destruction of cities like Aquileia and Padua, and also boosted the rise of papal power through successful diplomatic mediation. With Attila, Mackinder also explains in detail how the physical division between the Russian forests and steppes shaped the internal historical dynamics of Russia. Originally, Russia developed in the relatively protected environment of the northern forests, while the open south was the stage for constant invasions. This reality created two different political and cultural realities within Russian territory. While the forests favored stable and protected settlements, the steppes were a natural corridor for attacks coming from Asia, especially through the corridor between the Ural Mountains and the Caspian Sea. The constant threat of incursions coming from this region of Eurasia greatly delayed Russian political and social development for centuries, to the point that Mackinder states that Russian history during the medieval and Renaissance periods was, to a large extent, determined by the direct and indirect impacts of these invasions. But he also suggests that understanding this geographic dynamic is essential not only to comprehend past history, but also to interpret today's political dynamics and consequently future actions, suggesting that the world was entering a historical moment in which the struggle would no longer be for possession of unknown lands, but for relative efficiency and direct competition between powers. He emphasizes the need to deeply understand the geographic forces derived from this process that shape societies and global politics. Mackinder develops his famous Heartland thesis, or continental heart, from integrated geographic and historical analysis. He states that the Eurasian region, particularly the central area, which he called the geographic pivot or heartland, would be decisive for the control of world power in the 20th century. Thus, Mackinder explores in detail the importance of the physical characteristics of the Eurasian continent and their effects on the dynamics of global history, with special attention to the role of the great steppes and rivers as natural routes for human movement and political expansion. He notes that the rivers flowing from the forested regions of Eastern Europe toward the seas, Black and Caspian, cross entirely the vast steppes of southern Russia. He points out how these river routes, although less important than the steppes themselves, had very significant historical episodes. For example, missionaries of Greek Christianity used the Dnieper River to reach Kiev, while before them the Vikings had descended the same river towards Constantinople. And before that, the Germanic Goths briefly appeared along the Dniester River to cross Europe, coming from the Baltic Sea. However, Mackinder emphasizes that these events were transitory, not invalidating his broader thesis, which was that for about 1,000 years, nomadic peoples from the Asian steppes continuously crossed the wide passage between the Ural Mountains and the Caspian Sea, dominating southern Russia, and advancing into Europe, especially Hungary, they shaped European history through ongoing destruction, and especially by Asian nomads. The Huns, Avars, Magyars, Bulgars, Khazars, and Mongols strongly defined the political and social organization of Central and Eastern Europe. The mobility of these warrior tribes across the vast steppes of southern Russia allowed their attacks to reach central areas of Europe with relative ease. This profoundly transformed the political development of European peoples, who were forced to react defensively, thus generating unity and national identity. Significant historical events happened directly because of these invasions. Mackinder then introduces another example of historical mobility, rivaling the land mobility of the nomads, the maritime mobility of the Vikings. The Vikings, sailing in small boats, attacked and penetrated deep into the European continent through rivers and seas, temporarily settling both in the north and south of Europe. Viking mobility, however, was limited in scope by the physical conditions of Europe, being restricted to areas near the coasts and navigable waterways. Despite this limitation, their historical influence was very significant. It was decisive in the creation of national unity in countries like England and France, and in the weakening or division of others, such as Italy. For Mackinder, these two forms of mobility, that of the Asian land nomads and the Viking sea navigators, operated simultaneously. They pressured the sedentary societies of Europe from different directions, thus stimulating the formation of modern political structures. He also mentions the role of the great Eurasian landmass in general. Mackinder points out that, due to the distance from the seas and the aridity associated with the central location of this great landmass, the central region of Eurasia, or Euroasia, has large dry areas, relatively lacking in water resources accessible to the ocean. Because of this, even though there is water in the form of rivers, many of these waterways do not flow into the sea. This isolation created ideal conditions for nomadic societies, which developed superior land mobility skills using horses and camels. This geographical configuration favored the emergence of warrior tribes, highly mobile and aggressive, capable of launching quick and devastating offensives against the sedentary agricultural settlements around them. With this, he describes the great impact of the Mongol expansion that took place in the 13th century, started by the Mongol horsemen, who advanced 5,000 kilometers to the west, causing massive destruction in regions such as Poland, Hungary, and Serbia. In addition to this initial attack, other Mongol groups followed alternative routes, such as through Persia to Syria or from Central Asia to China, expanding the mobile power of the steppes to all of Asia and the Middle East, indirectly affecting even distant regions such as India and China. This Mongol episode is cited by Mackinder as proof of the unique ability of the Eurasian steppes to project military power quickly over long distances. He also points out that these invasions coming from Central Asia had major implications in shaping events. Key events such as the rise of the European Crusades originally started in response to the aggressive actions of the Seljuks coming from the Asian steppes against Jerusalem. The Crusades, even though they did not achieve their immediate objectives, stimulated a new collective awareness in Europe, accelerating its development and internal strengthening. But Mackinder highlights a crucial limitation of this nomadic mobility. It was restricted to the open plains and therefore lost its strength when encountering the forests and mountain ranges of Central and Western Europe, allowing sedentary peoples to react and, with that, shape their own political and cultural identity. And the same with the maritime mobility of the Vikings coming from Scandinavia. The Vikings sailed across European seas and rivers, attacking, colonizing, and influencing the political development of the continent, especially in areas close to the coasts and rivers. Mackinder argues that these two pressures, the land-based nomadic attacks from the east and the maritime attacks from the north and west, played a fundamental role in shaping medieval and modern Europe, forcing nations like England and France to achieve national unity and to foster a collective defensive consciousness. He draws a fundamental historical comparison by noting that the great cultural divide between Rome and Greece persisted. to a certain extent through the ways in which the European peoples were Christianized, the Teutons by the Romans, and the Slavs predominantly by the Byzantine Greeks. This cultural divide was later reflected as well in the division between the maritime mobility of Western Europeans, influenced by Rome, and the overland Eurasian mobility of the East, influenced by the Greek tradition. Mackinder connects this detailed analysis to a broader strategic vision, stating that the discovery of the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of the African continent for Asia completely revolutionized global geographic dynamics. This discovery provided European powers with unprecedented maritime mobility, allowing them to surround Central Eurasia, and thus reversing the old scenario in which Europe was constantly threatened by the peoples of the steppes. If before Europe was vulnerable to Asian land incursions, now Western Europe began to exercise global naval power, dominating world sea routes and strategically isolating the land forces of Eurasia. This contrast between maritime power and land power essentially represents Mackinder's central theory, later known as the Heartland theory, which is about controlling the central region of Eurasia. He says, whoever controls the geographical pivot of history gains a decisive advantage in world domination. Another important point he highlighted is the rise of Russia as the natural heir to the power of the steppes, replacing the Mongols. Over the centuries, especially after the 15th century, Russia overcame the old limitation imposed by the northern forests with the expansion of the Cossacks to the south, transforming areas previously dominated by nomadic peoples into agricultural lands inhabited by Russians. He especially highlights the very large migration of Russian peasants to the south, which developed agricultural regions in the former steppes, previously territory of Asian invasions. This greatly transformed the economic and demographic reality of Eastern Europe, as well as giving Russia a new strategic position and more effective land power. But something would change in the 19th and 20th centuries, the advancement of new technologies that would be revolutionary. Mackinder emphasizes that the strategic importance of land power, previously challenged by sea power during the Age of Discovery, was once again strengthening thanks to the development of transcontinental railways. He explains that continental railway systems, unlike maritime systems, allowed for direct transportation of goods and troops without the need for multiple transfers at intermediate ports. This gave a growing advantage to Eurasian land power, especially to Russia. Mackinder emphasizes that this new railway network provided Russia with unprecedented mobility, directly connecting Western Europe to the Pacific coast through Siberia to Vladivostok. This meant a strategic repositioning of Eurasia as a major center of land power in opposition to European maritime dominance, which prevailed in previous centuries during the Columbian era. And therefore the future risk that, if a powerful state controlled the heartland, like Russia, and allied itself with an industrial and technological power like Germany, this union could create a gigantic land force, capable of even threatening the maritime powers and their peripheries. For him, such an alliance would have the potential to dominate the world, due to the immense economic and military power concentrated in that great Eurasian continental mass. That's why Mackinder foresaw the strategic need to counterbalance this threat by forming alliances among peripheral maritime powers, such as France, the United Kingdom, the United States, Italy, and Japan, aiming to encircle and limit the land power of Russia or any power that might come to control the heartland. He specifically warned about the danger of a Russo-German alliance as an example of how the balance of world power could be drastically altered, threatening the dominance of traditional maritime powers. But Mackinder did not remain stagnant in this theory. He revisited and expanded it years later in other publications, such as the book Democratic Ideals and Reality, a study on the politics of Reconstruction. Here he separates two perspectives, that of the men of the sea and that of the men of the land. In this sense, he begins by highlighting how, until relatively recently, humanity perceived the ocean as two separate seas, one to the west and another to the east. Only after the discovery and exploration of the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope did humanity truly understand the ocean as a single, integrated entity. This perception brought profound implications for global maritime power. He then suggests that although the world has become fully known geographically, with the North and South Poles reached and all important territories mapped, the practical understanding of this reality is still influenced by previous historical perceptions. He illustrates this argument by describing how the European powers, which previously faced vast unknown regions, now had to deal with a closed geopolitical system, in which all lands are politically claimed, and where any conflict or crisis has immediate repercussions in all parts of the world. And it was globalization that brought about this new reality. Mackinder then goes on to analyze the historical evolution of maritime power, starting with the example of ancient Egypt, using the Egyptian civilization as an initial example of power. Ancient Egypt's river navigation provided all key geographical elements needed for advanced civilization development: a navigable river, the Nile River, fertile soil, natural protection from the surrounding deserts, and a linear structure that facilitated communication and political control. Mackinder directly compares this situation in Egypt with what later existed in the Mediterranean Sea, highlighting that there was also an important maritime base there, with the same natural conditions but expanded to a larger scale. But in the Mediterranean context, more specialized societies emerged, with peoples dedicated exclusively to navigation and trade, such as the Phoenicians and the Greeks. He also mentions how countries that are predominantly land or sea powers can change their definition of power, becoming exactly the opposite of what they were before. In other words, can a nation that is predominantly focused on maritime power become a land power, or vice versa? And he gives as an example precisely the Roman Empire, which after the Punic Wars turned the Mediterranean into a closed sea, dominated by a single land power that controlled all maritime access along the coast. At that moment, maritime power was definitely replaced by land power, which controlled the ports. It no longer needed large fleets because it controlled all the coastal bases. After the Roman Empire fell, the situation reversed again. The Mediterranean stopped being a Roman closed sea and became a border conflict zone between Christians and Muslims. With the Islamic expansion from the south and east and the Viking invasion from the north, the sea was reopened to naval conflict. Mackinder then discusses the great maritime transformation that took place during the Age of Discovery, when Portuguese and Spanish navigators, after centuries confined within the Latin Peninsula, Western Europe broke through the European maritime boundaries and opened the way for ocean routes around the Cape of Good Hope. The discovery of this route to the Indies changed the global strategic logic by allowing European powers to attack the old land-based powers from the maritime rear. Mackinder explains how the discovery and use of these maritime routes by the Portuguese and Spanish created new maritime power centers on islands and small strategic peninsulas like Hong Kong, Singapore, Cape of Good Hope, and Aden, allowing then the European maritime powers to dominate world trade and establish strategic bases on every continent. He especially highlights the British historical case, observing how Great Britain managed to establish a dominant global position from a relatively small yet extremely fertile and secure territorial base protected by the English Channel. For Mackinder, the productive English soil, later combined with coal and iron reserves, was the true foundation of British maritime supremacy, allowing them to sustain their naval fleet and expand globally. In this context, he mentions that the successive attempts to challenge British maritime dominance through attacks launched from the European continent, whether by the Spanish, the Dutch, or sometimes the French. They failed due to Britain's fundamental geographic advantages. Mackinder details how, after consolidating its position in Europe, Britain expanded its dominance to even more distant seas, especially in the Indian Ocean, establishing the so-called British Raj in India, sustained not by the permanent presence of large fleets in that region, but by the British maritime capability to project power over long distances from its original base in the North Atlantic. The Indian Ocean was, in practice, a closed sea under British control. not by the direct use of military forces stationed there, but by the absence of any other power with sufficient resources to challenge English security at sea. After thoroughly outlining the historical trajectory of British maritime supremacy, Mackinder connects these historical events to broader global geographic realities. He introduces the fundamental concept of the world island, arguing that Eurasia, Europe, Asia, and a united Africa formed a great global island surrounded by oceans. A concept that is not only geographical, but also deeply strategic, because here he warns again about the fundamental strategic danger that would exist if this world island were to be politically unified, under a single power capable of using its vast internal resources to project itself as a maritime power. In this hypothetical situation, no peripheral island power like Great Britain or the United States would be able to rival the naval and human capacity of such a power centralized in Eurasia. Mackinder then notes a key historical similarity between England and the United States. Both began their history with internal conflicts and external threats, evolved from a continental to an insular situation, and finally assumed a decisive global role through maritime projection. The United States, from his perspective, were beginning to understand that they are not an isolated continental entity, but rather a strategic island in relation to the enormous Eurasian world island. A new understanding that led them to decisively enter the First World War alongside the maritime powers. He then explores the point of view of the landman in contrast to that of the sailor, making clear the importance of the interior regions of the great Eurasian continent. The world island, its physical characteristics, and its strategic implications for global politics. Mackinder explains that just as the great navigations revolutionized human perception of the unity of the oceans in the past, modern advances in land and air communication were then revealing a new continental unity, profoundly redefining geopolitical relations. He especially emphasized that, until then, the peoples of the maritime powers viewed the Eurasian continent as externally focused on the coasts without clearly perceiving what was happening in the vast interior areas inaccessible to maritime power. He details how a vast portion of the continent is made up of regions inaccessible to maritime navigation, being dominated by rivers that flow into frozen seas or enclosed lakes, like Volga, Ural, Albany, Salino, and so on, besides the inland basins of the Caspian Sea and the Aral Sea. Now you already know that he calls this great interior space, inaccessible by sea routes, the Heartland, the continental heart. A vast territory favorable to land mobility, traditionally based on horses and camels, but which would gradually be integrated by the power of the railroad. To the south of the Heartland is the Iranian Plateau, with mountains and high plateaus that act as a kind of natural barrier, separating it from the oceans to the south, increasing its characteristic of strategic isolation. Mackinder compares this northern heartland with another large interior space, the southern heartland of sub-Saharan Africa, also characterized by vast savannas and open grasslands, and equally inaccessible to direct maritime communication due to natural obstacles such as cataracts and large waterfalls. He highlights how these large continental interiors have historically allowed for land mobility, mainly by means of horses and camels. In parallel, coastal mobility was made possible by the ocean in the fertile peripheral regions. Between these two large continental spaces of the north and the south, Mackinder places the intermediate region of Arabia and the Sahara. These regions, despite being arid, are important passage routes between the two great heartlands and also between the heartlands and the fertile, densely populated regions around the oceans. Europe and India, China. He draws special attention to Arabia, highlighting it as a critical strategic geographic zone since it is crossed by major historic waterways such as the Nile, the Red Sea, and the Persian Euphrates. Traditionally being a region of geographic and strategic connection between the continents, this intermediate axis of Arabia and the Sahara separates Eurasia and Africa into three major habitable and productive peripheral regions: Europe, the Indies, and the African coastal region. All these three peripheral regions are extremely populated, highly fertile and rich due to the ease of maritime and river navigation and the favorable climate conditions, clearly contrasting with the vast open and grazing lands of the interior, which are sparsely populated. He concludes this historical and geographical reflection by pointing out that, historically, the global political and military dynamic has been shaped by the strategic dispute between these great interior spaces, which favored land power based on animal mobility, and the coastal and peripheral regions which favored maritime power. Throughout history, great empires, from the ancient Egyptian Empire and Babylonian Empire to the modern European empires, were formed and overthrown. Depending on their ability to simultaneously control these different strategic environments, maritime and land. Then, Mackinder presents the rise of the Arabs as an example of how land-based power, relying on mobility, can project itself over great distances. Arabs, originally nomads from Arabia's interior, built a vast empire by strategically using horses and camels for mobility. Their armies conquered key regions around the great landmass, from Spain and North Africa in the west to India and Southeast Asia in the east. Although the Arabs also established a maritime presence, they did not have a large enough population base to maintain their global domination. Mackinder notes that although the Arabs had some success in combining land and sea power, their empire fell. Not because of naval defeat, but due to the pressure from land forces coming precisely from the Eurasian continental heartland, especially from the Turks. Mackinder concludes by stressing the vital role of Eurasia in modern geopolitics, stating that the heartland now offers unprecedented opportunities for land power to threaten global maritime hegemony. For him, any political project or peace treaty must explicitly recognize this geographic and strategic reality. Otherwise, the heartland, the continental core, will continue to be the potential center of future geopolitical and military storms. He calls this era the post-Columbian era, but I call it the Mackinderian era, precisely because it wasn't created by Mackinder. No, after all, it existed before he was born, and it's a direct result of the Industrial Revolution, but the Mackinderian era. Because he was the first to notice this global configuration that defines the world to this day, and most likely for a few centuries. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and a special thanks to the category member supporter of De Leon as Portas da Cidade. Remember to subscribe and share this video with everyone you know. Real Geopolitics. Only with your support can I continue bringing this kind of content to you. Hugs, see you next video.